When most people think of World War II code breaking, their minds jump to the Enigma machine, the jagged typewriter of secrets that Bletchley Park famously unraveled. And while that victory saved untold lives, it was only one battle in a much deeper, more secret war, a war fought not just with radio waves and punch cards, but with silence, disappearance, and unresolved anomalies. The cipher war most people never heard about was waged in shadows, darker than any battlefield. Behind locked rooms and forged identities, signals intelligence teams in Britain, the US, Germany, and the Soviet Union stumbled onto transmissions they couldn't categorize. Messages with no clear origin, codes that didn't follow mathematical logic, and keys that seemed to rewrite themselves. These weren't military dispatches or diplomatic chatter. Some came from abandoned outposts, others from locations that didn't exist on any wartime map. They weren't intercepted. They were discovered as if left behind by something older or stranger. While Enigma could be modeled, reverse engineered, and defeated with enough logic and luck, these other systems resisted all attempts. To this day, some remain unsolved, not because they were complex, but because they defied conventional patterns entirely. They hinted at a different kind of intelligence war, one fought not for nations, but for silence. And the deeper cryptologists looked, the more they began to wonder, were all these signals human? Or had they stumbled into a frequency never meant to be heard? Winston Churchill was no stranger to secrets. He thrived in them, manipulated them, and when necessary, buried them so deeply they were never meant to surface. But among the thousands of classified documents that have trickled into public view since the war's end, a pattern emerges, one too subtle to be accidental. Certain briefings he received, often delivered by hand and burned shortly after, were never archived. The topics they hinted at have been redacted or scrubbed entirely. Why? In 1953, a small team at Bletchley Park attempted to revisit a cipher intercepted near the end of the war. The original signal had never been solved. Within hours of initiating their review, the order came down: terminate the analysis immediately, no reason given. The directive came not from the Foreign Office, but from Churchill's personal intelligence liaison, and this wasn't the first time. Declassified memos suggest Churchill was shown intelligence that neither MI5 nor GCHQ dared preserve. A pattern of extreme sensitivity surrounded a cluster of messages dated between January and March 1945, some linked to obscure frequencies and unnamed sources. Was it fear of foreign powers? Or did these signals reveal something so disruptive, so destabilizing, that even victory couldn't justify disclosure? Whatever it was, Churchill took it to his grave, and historians are left with only shadows. In early 1944, as Allied forces prepared for what would become the D-Day landings, a strange anomaly began appearing in the intercepted signal logs. Dozens of messages, clearly formatted in German military cipher, were being picked up across southern England and northern France. But something was off. The signal strength was erratic. The call signs were unknown, and most disturbing of all, the coordinates embedded within the messages pointed to positions where no German units were ever confirmed to exist. British intelligence classified them as phantom ciphers. Their formatting mimicked Kriegsmarine protocols, yet encryption keys didn't match any known Enigma or Lorenz variants. When analysts at Bletchley attempted decryption using traditional methods, the messages collapsed into unreadable noise. Some theorized they were decoys, deliberate fakes to throw off Allied operations. But others weren't so sure. In one particularly unnerving case, A ghost signal predicted a U-boat assault 3 days before it happened, despite being traced to an inland point in Belgium. The target was real. The source wasn't. Internal memos warned of transmissions of non-local origin, suggesting advanced German tech or foreign relay systems. But quietly, a handful of analysts believed something far more unsettling, that these ghost codes weren't coming from German forces at all. They were coming from somewhere or someone else. And yet Allied strategy changed based on them, because how could they afford not to listen? As the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, Hitler's inner circle grew more desperate and more secretive. Communication became paranoid, fragmented, and encrypted to a level that stunned even Allied codebreakers. Amid the chaos, a new protocol emerged. It was whispered about in intercepted chatter, referred to only by its code name, Nachtgott, the night god. According to scattered records, Nachtgott was not just another cipher. It was an entirely different system, developed not by the Wehrmacht or even the SS, but under direct supervision of Hitler's personal cryptographic staff. Enigma had already been compromised. Lorenz, too, was no longer secure. Nachtgott was intended to be the Reich's unbreakable final word. Surviving notes suggest it was never implemented on a wide scale. Only a handful of transmissions are suspected to have used it, all in the last 3 weeks of the war. British and American listening stations identified irregular bursts of data, strange in rhythm and format. They didn't resemble Morse or even digital pulse. One analyst described them as structured static, sound engineered to carry patterns the human ear could not detect. When Berlin fell, the few known operators linked to Nachtgott either vanished or were executed on the spot. No cipher machine was ever found, no documents, just a persistent rumor that the night god spoke only when everything else was lost, and what it said has never been deciphered. Among the stranger whispers that emerged from the wreckage of Nazi Germany was a rumor that seemed too bizarre to be true, even for a regime obsessed with secrecy. Hidden within the testimonies of captured SS officers and cryptology staff were repeated references to something called Säureverschlüsselung, the acid encryption. It wasn't a metaphor. According to scattered reports, this was not a machine cipher nor a paper code. It was said to use chemical compounds, acids and bases, applied to specialized paper in precise sequences to encode information physically. The reactions would appear only under certain environmental conditions. Humidity, heat, even specific wavelengths of light. The messages could disappear, morph, or become permanently illegible if exposed incorrectly. In theory, it was brilliant, an encryption that was self-destructing by design, beyond digital detection, unreadable by interception alone. But no known sample has ever been recovered. No formula, no working prototype, no machine-readable format. Historians dismissed it as fabrication. Yet Allied intelligence took it seriously enough to assign analysts to trace the theory. Soviet files later revealed that their own wartime chemists were instructed to replicate German solvent encryption systems, with no documented success. Whether Säureverschlüsselung truly existed or was merely a ghost born of paranoia remains one of cryptography's most elusive puzzles. Because if it was real, it means the Nazis may have invented a code that literally erased itself from history. In the final days of the war, Allied forces, both Western and Soviet, rushed not just to conquer territory, but to seize knowledge, codebooks, cipher machines, encrypted communications, anything that could unlock the strategic mind of the Reich. In bunkers beneath Munich, abandoned SS headquarters, in Warsaw, and even inside the wreckage of Berlin's chancellery, fragments of a mysterious cipher system were recovered. But something was different. These were not Enigma rotors or Lorenz strips. They were pages of code that didn't fit any known framework, untranslatable, undetectable, unbreakable. The Americans archived their findings under Project TACITURN, believing they'd eventually decode them using emerging computer systems. The Soviets, meanwhile, assigned a dedicated team of linguists, mathematicians, and psychologists to do the same. Both sides failed. Some of the symbols weren't part of any alphabet, Roman, Cyrillic, or otherwise. Others changed position depending on context, almost as if the language itself was adaptive. A 1951 U.S. intelligence report concluded this may not be a code meant for human decryption. Theories spiraled. Was it a rogue invention, disinformation, or something built not to communicate, but to mislead anyone who tried? For over 80 years, no one has made meaningful progress. Today, the cipher fragments sit in cold storage, untouched by modern cryptanalysis, not because they're forgotten, but because some believe breaking them might reveal something too volatile to publish. December 1944. The Ardennes forest groaned under the weight of fresh snow and advancing chaos as Hitler launched his final major offensive on the Western Front. American and British units scrambled to reposition. One small Allied unit, an intelligence detachment embedded near Bastogne, intercepted troubling movement behind enemy lines. A hastily encoded message was transmitted just before midnight on December 17th. Its contents, though never fully recovered, were believed to be a warning, a shift in German tactics that could outflank the northernmost Allied units. The signal was sent through standard Allied cipher protocol, validated, confirmed, and cleared for immediate high command delivery. And yet, inexplicably, it never arrived. Military archives later confirmed the transmission passed through the first two routing stations before vanishing entirely. The official explanation cited weather-related interference, but internal correspondence between signal officers tells a different story, one of confusion, denial, and a desperate attempt to find a scapegoat. The consequences were immediate. That morning, a vulnerable Allied convoy was ambushed. Nearly an entire platoon was lost. Survivors later testified that they'd expected reinforcements, repositioning based on an order that never came. How does a message disappear mid-transmission in a network designed for redundancy? Some blamed faulty equipment. Others, more quietly, wondered if the signal was intercepted and rerouted. But intercepted by who? No German logs ever showed it. In the end, the message didn't just vanish, it erased an opportunity to prevent bloodshed, and it left behind a silence that still stings. 2 days after the Ardennes message vanished, a young British signal operator was found dead at his post inside a field relay station near Liège. His body showed no wounds, no signs of struggle, just a slight trace of blood from the nose and eyes frozen wide open, locked on his equipment. The machinery still hummed. The signal log showed his final transmission had been sent, cleanly and without interference. But when forensic analysts reviewed the recording, something stood out. The encryption used wasn't standard Allied protocol. It resembled Allied ciphers, same structure, same signature keys, but with slight deviations. Symbols in places where numbers should have been, repetitions that followed no internal logic. At first, it was assumed to be operator error, but when analysts tested the key combinations, the message refused to unlock. And then came the most disturbing discovery. The cipher didn't match any registered allied or enemy system. This rogue pattern, nicknamed black tape by decoding teams, would surface again in unrelated transmissions across Belgium and northern France. Always brief, always untraceable, and always following sudden deaths or disappearances of field operatives. The cause of the young operator's death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest. But those who reviewed his logs said he'd been attempting to decode the message at the moment he died, and whatever was in that signal, it was meant for no living audience. In 1998, more than half a century after the Battle of the Bulge, a batch of declassified MI5 files quietly surfaced at the National Archives. Buried within a folder labeled Signal Irregularities, Continental Front, were memos, correspondence, and internal reviews that re-examined the vanished Ardennes transmission. What they revealed shook even seasoned historians. The signal may not have been lost by accident. It may have been deliberately silenced. One internal analysis, marked top secret, eyes only, pointed to inconsistencies in the routing logs. The signal's unique ID, meant to track its path through multiple relay stations, had been manually overwritten in one junction node. This kind of interference could not happen without high-level access. More troubling still, the tampering occurred within a British-controlled node, not one under enemy fire or duress. The files included testimony from a now-deceased intelligence officer who claimed the message contained instructions that contradicted agreed strategy. He suggested, without naming names, that certain individuals within the Allied ranks viewed the signal as a threat to ongoing operations. Sabotage from within. Not by traitors, perhaps, but by those seeking a different outcome. One that required silence rather than action. The message was never recovered, but what remains is a scar in Allied communications history, a whisper of betrayal buried beneath medals, victories, and sanitized official narratives. In the bleak winter of 1943, deep in the heart of Siberia, a Soviet military listening post near Irkutsk registered a transmission that no one could explain. The message arrived in a steady pulse, clear, rhythmic, and unmistakably artificial. But when Soviet cryptologists tried to translate it, they hit a wall. The signal wasn't in Russian. In fact, it wasn't in any known language. It wasn't code in the traditional sense. No recognizable ciphers, no frequency hopping, no repetition patterns to exploit. Just a continuous stream of modulated tones and structured sequences that sounded, to the human ear, more like music than communication. Analysts initially assumed it was interference or natural radio phenomena, but then came the strange part. It repeated, precisely, every 4 hours. The broadcast continued uninterrupted for 3 days. Soviet teams triangulated the signal to a remote facility near Lake Baikal, an old mining outpost officially listed as decommissioned since 1939. When a small reconnaissance team was dispatched to investigate, they found the building locked from the inside. Inside were frozen corpses, 2 radio technicians, both dead for over a year. The station inexplicably had power, and after that final transmission, no more signal, nothing. Just a cold frequency of silence where something had once spoken. No one could explain how the dead had broadcast a message, or why it had nothing to say in any human tongue. In the decades following the Irkutsk incident, Soviet and later Russian cryptologists continued to revisit the strange 1943 transmission. By the late 1970s, a new theory began to gain traction. One that abandoned the idea of letters, numbers, or even conventional symbolism altogether. What if the message wasn't built for human interpretation? What if it wasn't language at all, but something older? Linguists began analyzing the signal using methods borrowed from music theory and acoustic modeling. They found structured intervals, rises and falls in pitch and amplitude that mirrored harmonic scales, but with unfamiliar timing. These weren't melodies, they were patterns, deliberate engineered. Some liken them to whale songs or neural pulses, communication by rhythm, not by grammar. A 1982 KGB-funded study proposed the idea of pre-linguistic encoding, a form of communication based on sonic math, theoretically understandable by any being capable of processing rhythm and repetition. Not emotion, not intention, just pure structure. The implication that the signal wasn't meant to be read or translated, it was meant to be recognized like a beacon. Western analysts later speculated the message could have been machine-targeted, broadcast for a specific receiver not made of flesh and bone, something waiting or hiding in the vastness of the Soviet frontier. To this day, the idea remains fringe. But the unnerving question lingers. If it wasn't meant for us, who or what was it calling? In 1947, during the chaotic post-war intelligence gold rush, a defector from the Soviet Union crossed into West Berlin with a briefcase of documents and a single metal reel. Among the materials was an audio recording labeled only with Cyrillic letters, translating to Irkutsk, 1943, unresolved. The reel was handed over to American intelligence and quietly transferred to a small research facility in Maryland. What happened next remains largely obscured, but declassified inventory logs confirm the reel's existence in U.S. archives by 1948. There are no public records of analysis, no memos, no reports, just a mention in a 1952 CIA internal index of nonverbal foreign signal artifacts, then for over 50 years, silence. In 2001, following a wave of post-Cold War transparency acts, the reel appeared again in a reclassification memo. The document, which is still partially redacted, states simply, Irkutsk signal. Level 5, directive, review not recommended, archive access closed indefinitely. No explanation, no scientific justification, just a renewed seal. Former intelligence officers have speculated that the signal was played and analyzed, and that what was discovered raised concerns beyond national security. Perhaps its origin, perhaps its purpose, or perhaps what or who it was meant for. One thing is clear, the Irkutsk transmission didn't just vanish. It was captured, studied, and then buried. Not because it was meaningless, but because somehow it meant too much. In the spring of 1944, as Allied bombers swarmed across occupied Europe, a quiet circle of amateur radio operators in Rome began noticing something strange. Between the usual wartime chatter, encrypted German signals, and the rare snatch of music from far-off stations, there emerged a ghost frequency, thin, inconsistent, and just barely audible over the static. But it wasn't the signal itself that drew their attention. It was what came next. Each time the mysterious frequency was picked up, a bombing would follow, always within 48 hours. Sometimes within 12 Allied raids on key German installations, troop positions, even rail lines, targets no civilian could possibly know in advance. But the shadow frequency came first, every time. The transmissions were brief and curiously structured, often including snatches of Latin, coded numbers, and, most puzzling of all, brief references to saints or religious feast days. At first, these seemed like coincidence, until one night the signal referenced San Lorenzo in Tenebris. 2 days later, the San Lorenzo district of Rome was obliterated in one of the deadliest Allied airstrikes of the campaign. Where were these broadcasts coming from? By triangulating the signal, two operators narrowed it down to a source within Vatican City itself, more specifically near the Vatican Radio towers. But the church denied everything. Officially, no such signal existed. Unofficially, those who listened swore it was real and that someone behind the Vatican walls was broadcasting omens of fire. On the night of May 10th, 1944, at precisely 2:13 a.m., a shortwave radio enthusiast named Pietro Vassalli recorded what he would later call the most disturbing broadcast of his life. It began with faint choral music, Gregorian but off-key, as though degraded by time or distance. Then came a voice, male, soft, unwavering, speaking in formal Latin, the cadence measured, almost liturgical. Vassalli recognized several phrases from ancient Catholic texts, but woven into them were names that had no place in Scripture. Perit hodie beneventum, cras matera, terra incinere. Today Benevento perishes, tomorrow Matera, earth in ashes. Just over 8 hours later, the Allied Air Command launched a surprise bombing run that struck railway infrastructure in Benevento. Civilian casualties were heavy. A secondary operation, classified at the time, hit Matera within 36 hours. The broadcast, dubbed The Voice of the Ciphered Saint by Italian intelligence, aired only once, but Vassalli's recording made its way into the hands of the Italian resistance, then later to Allied ears. What troubled analysts wasn't just the eerie accuracy, it was the fact that the message included bombing coordinates that hadn't yet been finalized at the time of transmission. No origin was ever confirmed, and no Vatican acknowledgement ever came. But for those who heard it, the voice didn't feel like a man predicting war. It felt like a relic from some other layer of history, whispering through the airwaves, always one step ahead of the fire. In the years following the war, Vatican officials maintained a firm stance. The Holy See was neutral, uninvolved in military affairs, and certainly not a conduit for wartime intelligence. Vatican Radio, they insisted, served only spiritual and humanitarian purposes. Yet as more independent researchers pieced together reports from ham operators, military logs, and declassified Allied files, a troubling pattern emerged, one that Vatican denials could no longer fully obscure. Allied codebreakers, particularly those stationed in North Africa and southern Italy, had flagged strange signal fluctuations emanating from Vatican frequencies as early as late 1943. These weren't the standard transmissions of religious broadcasts or Red Cross bulletins. They were layered, embedded, often just a few hertz above or below the official signal. Some messages were modulated in such a way that they would only be picked up by older, analog equipment, like the surplus receivers used by resistance networks and amateur enthusiasts. Historians now suspect a covert operation ran beneath the Vatican's public broadcasts, one possibly orchestrated by sympathetic clergy or rogue signal engineers. The purpose? To embed intelligence into benign transmissions, smuggling vital information under the radar of both Axis and Allied scrutiny. Was it a humanitarian effort to warn civilians? A quiet alliance with the Allies? Or something older? An arcane form of encoded warning passed through centuries of clerical secrecy. The Church continues to remain silent, but the signals, faint, layered, inexplicable, still haunt the frequencies. At precisely 1:03 a.m. on August 7, 1945, just hours after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, a short coded transmission was sent from a heavily guarded communication outpost in Tokyo. The message lasted barely 20 seconds, but it sent ripples through Allied listening posts in the Pacific. It was unlike any transmission intercepted before or since. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine Japanese military broadcast. But when linguists attempted translation, confusion set in. The signal contained a hybrid of numeric sequences and classical kanbun, an archaic Chinese-inflected form of Japanese used primarily in imperial court writings and Shinto scripture. It referenced no specific military orders or locations. Instead, it spoke in poetic abstractions. The throne is veiled in ash. The shadow prepares to answer. 2 suns rise, only one shall burn. American cryptographers labeled it Tenno Protocol 01, suspecting it to be a code word for a retaliatory strike or final order from Emperor Hirohito. But no follow-up message ever came, and no second protocol was ever found. The language itself resisted full interpretation. The tone was ceremonial, almost funereal, less a command, more a prophecy. Who was the shadow preparing to answer? What did it mean for 2 suns to rise? And most unsettling of all, who exactly was the message intended for? It was sent, it was heard, but no one ever claimed to receive it. In the waning days of the war, as American forces closed in and Tokyo prepared for an inevitable reckoning, Japan's intelligence apparatus carried out one final directive: erase everything. Cryptographic departments were ordered to destroy codebooks, burn cipher wheels, and dismantle machines, an intentional act of national amnesia. Operators, bound by oath, often chose suicide over capture. Rooms once buzzing with cryptographic chatter fell silent, charred by their own secrets. But one thing remained untouched: the transmission now known as the Tenno Protocol. Recovered after Japan's surrender, the lone surviving copy of the message was found inside an imperial archive, tucked within a lacquered box marked with the chrysanthemum seal of the emperor. No other ciphers were preserved, no other documents spared. The question that haunted post-war analysts was simple: why this one? Some believed it was a message meant for Hirohito himself, a private signal confirming an internal plan or condition. Others whispered darker theories, that the message had no human audience, but served as a trigger, a ritualized broadcast fulfilling some ancient, ceremonial directive known only to the imperial court. When questioned in 1946 about wartime encryption practices, the emperor gave only vague answers, referring to protocols of silence. The Tenno Protocol remains one of the few pieces of Japanese wartime encryption left intact. It defied logic, escaped destruction, and still today, no one can say with certainty why or for whom it waited. Years after the war, in a restricted analysis conducted by U.S. cryptographers during the Korean War, fragments of the Tenno Protocol were re-examined with more advanced decryption tools. Though the archaic kanbun remained difficult to parse, a partial linguistic key, pieced together from captured Shinto texts, revealed phrases never seen in any official military document. Among them was a line that caused immediate alarm: "After the second flame, the third witness shall descend. The night shall not remember what the sun cannot bear." Analysts scrambled to understand its meaning. The second flame clearly referenced Nagasaki, but what was the third witness? And what event could be so severe that the night shall not remember it? Speculation ignited. Had there been a third intended strike, a secret plan aborted, or more chillingly, had something happened that history deliberately erased? Japanese records from August 10th to 12th, 1945, are curiously incomplete. Logs of communication in and out of southern Honshu are missing. Weather surveillance records, typically meticulous, were found doctored or blank. Local testimonies speak of strange lights over Mount Aso, sudden blackouts, and a military lockdown unrelated to the American invasion. No definitive evidence remains, but the language of the Tenno Protocol suggests a veiled aftermath, an event Japan never confessed and America never acknowledged. Perhaps some truths weren't hidden to protect governments. Perhaps they were hidden to protect the world from knowing them. In the aftermath of World War II, as the ashes of the Third Reich settled across Europe, the United States launched one of the most controversial intelligence operations in history, Operation Paperclip. Ostensibly created to extract scientific talent before the Soviets could, it became a shadow pipeline, funneling hundreds of former Nazi scientists, engineers, and cryptographers into American labs, military projects, and intelligence outposts. Among them were minds once tasked with designing the Third Reich's most advanced encryption systems. Most were quietly relocated, their wartime affiliations scrubbed clean, but one name stood out in the earliest Paperclip dossiers, Dr. Lucas Henning, a cryptanalytic specialist who had allegedly worked on non-linear cipher logic in a classified Berlin lab known as Abteilung 4. Henning was scheduled to arrive at Fort Hunt, Virginia in November 1946. He boarded the transport flight in Frankfurt. He never arrived. Military records show no crash, no detour. The plane completed its journey with all other personnel accounted for except Henning. His file was sealed and by 1948 officially marked as administratively closed. What could a cipher expert have known that made him vanish without a trace? Rumors surfaced years later that Henning had been diverted en route to a private facility in New Mexico, linked not to the Pentagon, but to atomic intelligence. If true, he may not have disappeared at all. He may have simply entered a project whose name we were never meant to know. In early 1947, a German cryptographic technician known only by his alias, F. Weber, was quietly transferred to Los Alamos under the expanded Paperclip directive. Unlike the high-profile rocket scientists and physicists already working on post-war atomic research, Weber's role was far less public. His background was in signal obfuscation and theoretical pattern encryption, techniques rumored to involve non-digital logic and chaotic wave interference. He was assigned modest housing just outside the Los Alamos facility, near a ridge that offered a view of the testing grounds. For 3 weeks, he kept a meticulous routine, reporting to the lab, working long hours, and retiring quietly to his quarters. Then one morning, he failed to appear. A search was ordered. What investigators found only deepened the mystery. Weber's bed was made. His clothing was untouched. His suitcase still packed. Breakfast, uncooked, sat beside a clean stove. Nothing was out of place, except the man himself. No signs of forced entry. No vehicle missing. Not even footprints outside his door. Colleagues claimed he'd grown withdrawn in the final days, asking questions about resonant cipher memory and signals that remember. He had requested access to classified frequency data recorded during the Trinity tests, data unrelated to his assignment. His disappearance was quietly buried. No notice, no press, no follow-up. It was as if the man who came to America to unmask hidden signals had simply become one. In the classified corridors of early Cold War intelligence, Weber's disappearance sparked more than suspicion. It ignited speculation. According to internal memos unearthed decades later, his final lab notes contained references not to enemy ciphers, but to synthetic resonance logic and non-harmonic repeaters, terms that baffled even advanced cryptographers. One phrase appeared multiple times, scrawled in the margins: pattern precedes purpose. Some within the intelligence community believed Weber had stumbled upon a pattern embedded in atomic test telemetry, an anomaly that mirrored the pulse structures from intercepted wartime signals never fully understood. If true, it suggested that some wartime transmissions may not have been human-generated at all, or at least not entirely. Others took a darker view that Weber, having been granted access to top-secret frequency archives, may have decrypted a layer of information that had been intentionally buried by German intelligence, by Allied forces, or by something older, nameless, and hidden in plain sight. A buried code not meant to be read. Theories diverged. Was he silenced to contain what he knew, or simply unmade by the knowledge itself? No body was found, no signal traced, no file released under any Freedom of Information Act has ever fully acknowledged his project's purpose. To this day, Weber remains a phantom in the archive, a man who may have decoded something history was not prepared to hear, and paid for it with his vanishing. In the winter of 1975, amid the static-choked airwaves of Cold War surveillance, a forgotten frequency flickered back to life. Amateur radio enthusiasts in Eastern Europe began reporting a strange mechanical voice on 13.83 megahertz, monotone, female, German accented. The numbers she recited followed a curious pattern: 5-digit sequences, repeated 3 times, then silence. At first, it was dismissed as yet another number station, part of the shadow world of espionage that had become white noise by that decade. But something was different. A former cryptographic analyst in Vienna, listening purely by habit, recognized the pattern, not the numbers themselves, but the format. It mirrored a World War II-era cipher used by the Kriegsmarine in 1942, one believed to have been permanently decommissioned after the Allied success at Bletchley Park. That system hadn't been heard for over 30 years. And yet, here it was, broadcasting like clockwork each Sunday at 3 a.m. GMT with chilling precision. Western intelligence agencies began monitoring it, but no official comment was made. The station didn't identify its origin, made no contact, and gave no indication of purpose. It simply was like a ghost repeating a ritual from a war long past. Who activated it? Who was meant to listen? And why resurrect a dead code, as if time itself had looped backward? The questions outnumbered the signals, and the voice continued. The question wasn't just how the broadcast was possible, it was why. In 1975, the Cold War was nearing its most volatile phase. Intelligence agencies were trading secrets, spies, and shadows. But this was different. The resurrection of a 1942 Kriegsmarine cipher wasn't standard espionage. It was a deliberate signal. But to whom? Some theorists argued the station was a signal to a long-dormant Nazi cell, an embedded network instructed to remain inactive until a specific sequence reappeared. Others believed it was ceremonial, a kind of cryptic ritual meant to mark a date or trigger a memory only certain recipients would understand. But there were darker speculations, too. One declassified NSA memo proposed that the station wasn't transmitting to anyone. It was transmitting about something. A countdown, perhaps. A buried archive. A warning encoded not in content, but in recurrence. The station broadcast every Sunday for nearly 6 months, then vanished without a trace. No equipment was ever found, no nation claimed responsibility, and no one officially decoded the full sequence. The voice stopped. The frequency fell silent, but the unease remained. It wasn't just that the past had spoken, it was that someone, somewhere, had gone to great lengths to make sure it did, not by mistake, not for nostalgia, but because something from that forgotten war still hadn't ended. Deep within the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum archives lies a collection of administrative documents recovered from Auschwitz-Birkenau. At first glance, they seem routine. Ledger pages listing prisoner numbers, transport schedules, work assignments. For decades, they were filed, scanned, and cataloged as part of the tragic bureaucracy of genocide. But in 2007, an archivist flagged something unusual: recurring numeric anomalies embedded in certain lists. Unlike most Nazi records, which were obsessively orderly, these documents contain subtle irregularities, sequences of prisoner numbers that skipped, then resumed or repeated, but only in specific rhythmic intervals. Initially assumed to be clerical errors, closer inspection revealed something stranger. These anomalies only appeared on documents linked to Block 6, a lesser-known barracks where several Jewish engineers, mathematicians, and physicists had been imprisoned. Survivor testimonies from Block 6 described these men working with charcoal and scraps, teaching each other calculus by memory, whispering equations as if reciting prayers. The Nazis had no idea what they were doing, but they were writing quietly, systematically into the documents they were forced to help manage. Unnoticed by the guards, unnoticed by the archivists, the patterns slept in plain sight for more than 60 years, until someone finally saw the code not as error, but as intention. And that discovery would lead to a question no one was prepared to answer. What had they hidden, and who was it meant for? In 2009, Dr. Elisa Meyerson, a data scientist working on archival digitization at the museum, ran a pattern recognition test on prisoner transport records. Her goal was to build a timeline visualization, but what she found broke her project entirely. The software flagged a string of anomalies buried within prisoner ID numbers from a specific date range in 1944. The numbers weren't random. They formed a Fibonacci sequence: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and it repeated, hidden within different columns using both Arabic and Hebrew numerals. At first, Meyerson assumed it was a coincidence, but the more documents she analyzed, the clearer the structure became. Prime numbers, modular loops, palindromic placements. They weren't errors, they were mathematics, embedded into death records, like equations written in blood. More astonishingly, the positioning of the numbers mirrored astronomical data, lunar cycles, eclipse patterns, solar alignments. The codes spanned across different transport lists, cross-referenced with dates of Allied bombings and known shifts in German troop movement. It wasn't just hidden, it was curated, assembled with obsessive care by men who had nothing but memory and terror to work with. How had they done it under such surveillance? Why use math as the language of resistance? Meyerson never answered those questions, but she decoded one final sequence at the bottom of a scorched page. Ein Regen aus Eisen kommt, der Himmel wird entscheiden. A rain of iron is coming, the sky will decide. The deeper researchers dug into the embedded cipher, the more unsettling the message became. These weren't just numeric games or codes of defiance. They were warnings or prophecies. References in multiple decoded fragments spoke of the Iron Judgment, the Twin Fires, and most eerily, the hour when the sun shall fall in silence. Terms that bore no meaning in the context of the camp's daily horrors, yet seemed charged with apocalyptic tension. The phrase metal rain appeared more than once. So did skyfire and the second silence after the first flash. Some dismissed it as poetic despair, metaphor shaped by suffering, but others weren't so sure. The timing, the precision, the astronomical parallels, they pointed to something else. One fragment, decoded in 2013, referenced an invisible city buried under light, a phrase still unexplained. Another matched the blast radius of Hiroshima, down to the kilometer. But how could men imprisoned without radio access in 1944 know anything resembling a nuclear event? Theories abound. Some suggest it was divine intuition. Others whisper of secret experiments, impossible knowledge, or messages meant to transcend their time. One researcher privately suggested the ciphers weren't warnings to us, but through us, a kind of historical signal encoded in suffering. Whatever the truth, it remains encrypted in ash and silence, a message humanity still struggles to understand. In the age of quantum computing and artificial intelligence, it seems unthinkable that any encryption devised with 1940s technology could remain unsolved. And yet, several World War II era codes, captured, recorded, archived, remain unreadable, not because they are too complex, but because they appear to defy the logic modern machines are built upon. AI systems designed for cryptanalysis have been trained on millions of known cipher patterns, from substitution to polyalphabetic to machine-generated code. They've cracked Cold War number stations and even ancient undeciphered manuscripts. But when presented with a cluster of wartime signals, specifically those labeled as failsafe enigmas by Allied archives, the systems stall, not because the data is corrupted, but because it's too clean, too exact, too structured. The signals show signs of recursive logic, patterns that loop without resolution or that shift depending on the moment of analysis. In several cases, AI algorithms identified structures that appear self-referencing, codes that react to the method attempting to decode them. Some theorists suggest these ciphers were designed not for decryption, but for deterrence, to resist every possible method of cracking, even future ones. Others believe they weren't meant to be solved by humans at all, which raises the chilling question: were these wartime messages truly human creations? Or are we facing encryption built on a form of intelligence and logic that we have yet to comprehend? Among the more obscure archives at GCHQ lies a category few outside the cryptographic world have heard of: red vault directives. These are signal events and cipher files considered too destabilizing to pursue further. Not because they threaten national security, but because their content, if ever decrypted, could unravel public trust, accepted history, or worse, invite existential uncertainty. One such directive, according to former intelligence analysts who've since spoken anonymously, involved a wartime signal intercepted in 1944 near the Arctic Circle. It used no known language. Its signal strength implied no terrestrial origin. Attempts to decode it caused anomalous output, strings of non-binary logic that defied even theoretical models. The file was sealed under a Level 7 designation, content not to be pursued by human or automated process. Other directives include references to frequency bands that produce psychosomatic effects in analysts exposed for extended periods, nausea, disorientation, even hallucinations. Some cryptologists have described dreams shored across analysis teams when working on specific cipher cases, as if the code was not only unreadable, but infectious. The official explanation is always the same: incomplete data, human pattern seeking gone awry. But off the record, insiders say differently, that some codes aren't encrypted to be secret, they're encrypted to be unopened. Like locked doors in the fabric of history, waiting only for someone curious or unlucky enough to try the handle. It's tempting to believe that the great conflicts of the 20th century ended with peace treaties and reconstruction. But in the realm of intelligence, something else continued. A quiet, invisible war, not over territory, but over knowledge, over what the past left behind, sealed in frequencies, buried in dead languages, and locked inside machines no longer understood. The post-war decades saw intelligence agencies shift from code breaking to code preserving. Signals too strange to explain were no longer studied. They were shelved. Unsolved messages weren't marked as failures. They were hidden in layers of bureaucracy, buried in acronyms, sealed beneath "no further action" stamps. Somewhere between secrecy and silence, the focus changed. The question was no longer, what does this mean, but what happens if someone finds out? Today, the battle continues, not in bunkers or on battlefields, but in backroom meetings and deep archives between those who believe some truths must be uncovered and those who believe they must never be known. Perhaps the most enduring enigma of World War II isn't what we couldn't crack, but what we were never meant to. And as we move deeper into an era where AI can think faster than any human ever could, the codes remain, waiting, watching, because some messages weren't written for answers. They were written to make us ask why they still whisper at all.